Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another IMS Facebook Live. I'm John Spalding, Director of Development and Communications at the Insight Meditation Society. And tonight I'm very pleased to be joined by Joseph Goldstein, co-founder of IMS and author of the wonderful book we'll be discussing this evening, The Experience of Insight, a simple and direct guide to Buddhist meditation. So tonight, Joseph and I will have a brief conversation about the book, probably for about 30 minutes or so. And then Joseph will lead a brief meditation sit for just like 2 minutes. And then we will take questions from you, the viewers. So if as we're talking, you have a question for Joseph, please feel free to just post it right there on the live, right there on Facebook, and we'll be monitoring them. And before we get started, I'd like to say just a few words about Joseph's book and why I'm excited about it. The Experience of Insight was his first book, and it was originally published by Shambhala in 1976, which just happened to be the same year that IMS was founded on Valentine's Day of that year. Joseph wrote the book based on the first month-long retreat that he, Sharon Salzberg, and others led in the Sequoia National Forest. The book follows the format of that first retreat held in California. It's 30 chapters long with a chapter for each day of the retreat. And it includes meditation instructions, Dharma talks, commonly asked questions, references to other spiritual traditions to help deepen our understanding. And the book went on to become a modern spiritual classic. This past fall, Shambhala released it in a new edition with a new preface by Joseph. And we've selected it as our January book for the IMS Book Club. If you want to join the book club, you can do so at the website, IMS website, dharma.org. It's right there on the homepage now. And what we're going to do in the club with Joseph's book is we are making it the center of a 30-day meditation challenge that will run throughout the month of January, starting on January 1, new year, new you. And the challenge will meet online for just 15 to 20 minutes a day at 9 a.m. each morning. The day will start at 11 on January 1 with a talk by Joseph, a conversation. And then if you can't join the daily sits throughout the month, we'll also be recording them for those of you who can't join. And the challenge will consist of a brief reading of each day's chapter from the book, along with a brief daily sit led by Josen Tamori Gibson. Josen is an IMS teacher, a participant in our IMS's teacher training program, and he also reads the audio version of the book, which is available on Audible. The book club is free, and if you join the book club, the 30-day challenge, you can get a free copy of Joseph's book by also becoming a member of Sustaining the Sangha, which is IMS's monthly giving program. So if you join for just $5 a month, or if you're already a member and you increase your monthly giving by $5 a month, we will send you a free copy of Joseph's book. For more information, you can email us at development@dharma.org for details. And there's also information right there on the post for this Facebook Live. So most of you know Joseph Goldstein, but for those of you who don't, Joseph has been a leading insight meditation teacher, leading retreats worldwide since 1974. He's co-founder, as I said, of the Insight Meditation Society, as well as the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies and the Forest Refuge, all of which are just a short walk from where Joseph is now sitting. His many books include Mindfulness, a practical guide for awakening, and One Dharma, the emerging Western Buddhism, which has a preface by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So with that, Joseph, welcome.
No, thanks, John.
Welcome, and thank you for your patience with that long intro. What's your secret? I suppose it's you do a lot of meditating.
Always helps.
Yeah. I'm really excited about this, Joseph, because this is our first Facebook Live together. Finally, I think done 4 with Sharon, and it's really wonderful to be doing this one with you. So just to get into your book, let's maybe go back a bit for a little more context. 1976, it was about 10 years earlier that you kind of got on this whole path, right? When you went to India in the mid 60s. How did you wind up in India? And more importantly, how did you wind up on a meditation cushion while you were there?
Well, it really started in 65, 66 when I was in the Peace Corps in Thailand. When I graduated college, I went into the Peace Corps, spent 2 years there teaching English, and I was stationed in Bangkok, just down the street from quite a famous temple called the Marble Temple. And about a year into my time there were a couple of monks, Buddhist monks, one Indian and one British, who started leading a discussion group for Westerners living in Bangkok just about Buddhism. And I really didn't know anything about it. I didn't have any background in Buddhism, but it was, I guess having studied philosophy in college, I had kind of that philosophic interest at first. And so I started going to these discussion groups, and at a certain point, one of the monks suggested, why don't you try meditating? And it was all very exotic. I was like 21, 22 years old, first time in the Far East, didn't know anything about meditation or Buddhism, but it captured my interest, when he described that. So I got my stuff together and I started sitting, first time for just 5 minutes. But something really quite extraordinary happened in terms of not a great enlightenment experience, but even in that first 5 minutes, I saw that there was a way to look into the mind as well as looking out through it. And so that was revelatory to me. It was like there's a methodology for understanding the mind. And I just got really excited by this. So excited that I started inviting my friends over to watch me meditate, which they didn't come back very often. But that's how enthusiastic I was about just this discovery of this possibility. And then after the Peace Corps, came back to the States and wanted to continue my practice, but I really hadn't had extensive instruction. So I was just mixing up a lot of different things, watching the breath and mantra and third eye, anything I had ever heard about meditation, and got very confused, just kind of jumbling everything up. And that's when I realized I needed a teacher and decided to go back to Asia. Friends had been in India, and so I stopped in India, what I thought would be on my way to Thailand, back to Thailand, and traveled around India a bit, going to different ashrams, looking for teachers, and ended up in Bodh Gaya, which is the place of the Buddha's enlightenment. And I met my first teacher there, Anagarika Munindra, who had just come back from 9 years studying, practice, and teaching in Burma. So that was really the beginning. That's how I ended up in Bodh Gaya, and really committing myself to the practice. I was there for most of the next 7 years. I came back to the States a few times in that period, but then would go back and continue my practice. And then it was in 74 when I first came back for good, to the States. So that was the early trajectory.
Yeah, and I want to ask you too, I think there's a great story about an early Goenka retreat that you attended in Bodh Gaya, a small retreat with only about 30 meditators there, but it was kind of an interesting cast of characters. Can you talk about what, isn't that where you met Sharon and Ram Dass?
Yeah, so that was, you got some of the details were not quite correct in that. Yeah, so I had been there since I went in 67, and then Goenkaji started teaching his first courses in the first course in Bodh Gaya in 1970, but it was actually a big course. There were about 100 people there. And it is where I met Sharon and Dan Goleman and Mirabai Bush and a lot of the people who had come to India and have since, back in the States now, really have had a profound influence, in the whole, could say the spiritual scene, of Eastern teachings. So it was a very seminal moment. Yeah.
Yeah. So then eventually, by 1974 is when you kind of came back to the United States and
Yeah.
back for good.
So I came back. I really had no idea what I was going to do. I had spent all of my 20s in Asia, 2 years in the Peace Corps, and then the following 7 years or so in India. So I came back to the States really not knowing, and I thought maybe I can, teach something maybe at a university or a college, or I really had no idea. So at that time I had met Ram Dass in India and we had become quite friendly. So I just wrote him a note, saying, I'm not quite sure what to do. Shall I, try to see if I can get a teaching job? And given his experience at the university and having been kicked out for his psychedelic experiments, he was not enthusiastic about that as a career path. And so then I just decided to travel cross country with a friend. And I stopped in Naropa, in Boulder, Colorado. Trungpa Rinpoche was just setting up the Naropa Institute. And 74 was the first summer sessions of it. And that was really the beginning, because that summer, it was like a Buddhist Woodstock. A couple of thousand people came from all over the country. So Ram Dass was there, Trungpa Rinpoche was there, a lot of other teachers. And Ram Dass had asked me to teach the meditation section of his big class. He would teach to all, a couple of thousand people. And he asked me to lead the meditation in different sections, for the people in his class. So I was working really hard. I was leading 6, 7, sessions a day, but people were so interested and so enthusiastic about getting some really clear, accessible instructions about meditation and how it related to the Buddhist teachings. And that was really the beginning. That was seeding, in a way, the whole Vipassana movement in this country. Because out of that, people were asking, well, can you teach a retreat? And so it was a very grassroots kind of unfolding.
And I think you told me, and correct me if I misremember, but I believe, so that was the summer of 74. And
Right.
You were in California just before that. And
Yeah,
you were
yeah.
planning this 30-day retreat that was going to happen after Naropa.
Yeah, correct. You have a better memory than I do about my life. Yeah, so that puts in an important detail. When I came back from India and had traveled across country, was with friends in California who had been in India earlier. And we just started talking about, well, what can we do? And so it was quite amazing, actually, that as a new teacher, I would think of, oh, well, let's have a month retreat. Usually people start teaching a weekend, or a week. But again, there was just so much enthusiasm, and interest at that time. So as we were talking, we planned for this month retreat in the Sequoia National Forest, Southern California. So we had all that set up. And then I did go to Naropa and connected with all these people, and it was many of those people at Naropa who then came to that retreat. But that was the beginning. That was the month long out of which the book emerged.
And to a certain extent, right, Ram Dass was sending people to you, right?
Yeah.
He's of a different tradition.
Yeah, well, he had done some Vipassana practice. He had studied with my teacher, Munindraji. He had studied with Goenkaji. And it wasn't his main spiritual practice, but he was quite involved with it for some time. And in fact, in later years, we were in Burma together studying with one of our teachers, Sayadaw Pandita. So he was very supportive and a tremendous help in kind of getting the whole ball rolling in this.
Yeah, we'll get back to the 30-day challenge in the book in a second. Just to put a little more history in there. So that was 74. It was just 2 years later. It was the next year, right, that you had eyed the property that became IMS, which you finally purchased in 76 with a group of others.
Right.
How did you? So for those, I mean, how did you wind up, of all places, finding a center in Barre, Mass, this kind of small, quiet town in central Massachusetts, when you were in California and Boulder and all over the...
Yeah, so after going around teaching for that first year or so, really wasn't living anyplace. I didn't have a home. I was just going from place to place. And so a few of us, Sharon and some others, just had the idea, boy, it would be great to have a center where people could come and we'd actually have a place to live. And people would come and we could offer teaching here as well as continuing to travel a lot. So a lot of the friends who had been together in India lived in Massachusetts. Then, even before IMS, after we had been teaching a little bit, we had the idea to teach a 3-month retreat. And we found a facility in Maine, in Bucksport, Maine. It was some kind of Catholic monastery or seminary, I forget. So we rented this place in Bucksport, Maine, all the while talking about, trying to further the idea of creating a center for ourselves. And some of the nuns at that place in Bucksport, we were talking to them, and they suggested contacting the Worcester diocese because there were a lot of properties that the church owned which were not being fully utilized, and so they were selling a lot of their monasteries or seminaries. So we contacted the Worcester diocese, and they said there was this place in Barre, Massachusetts, belonged to the Order of the Brothers of the Blessed Sacrament. And since our friends all lived in Massachusetts, it made it easy for us to go and check it out. And one story that Sharon tells a lot in particular, but it's really, it's a good story about the starting of IMS. So we came to look at it, was this big building, we can hold about 100 people on retreat. So it was this big empty building. And we were wondering, should we do this? Should we? It was kind of a big undertaking for basically a bunch of kids just back from India, So we went down to downtown Barre, which is very small, and we were just walking around the village green. And we saw this monument, on the village green, which had the Barre town motto. And we read the motto, which is tranquil and alert, which are the two words I think which best describes the whole path. The whole meditative path is tranquil and alert. So we really took that as a sign. And any town that has that as a motto should have a meditation center.
I think they were inviting you.
Yeah, exactly. So we just went for it. And, there was a lot of, I would say, fortunate naivete. We had no idea what we were getting in for. We really had no idea how to run a center. We had just been in India doing our own practice, but there was so much just enthusiasm for the Dharma. It had been so transformative for all of us, and it just opened a whole new world of discovery. That it didn't matter that we didn't really know how to run the center. We kind of trusted, we had faith in the Dharma, and so we just went for it. There's one other just interesting story about the the founding of IMS. So we made an offer, on this very big empty building. And at that time, it was for sale. This was big building, 90 acres of land for $150,000, which when we consider it today, it feels like, not much. But for us at that time, it was like $15 million. We really didn't have anything. But a few of our friends, we needed a $50,000 down payment. So a few of our friends kicked in $10,000, and we still needed $15,000 more. So in the second summer session of Naropa, I was teaching. And one time I was just sitting in my apartment, and a student in my class, one of my classes, Canadian woman, didn't really know her. She just came into my apartment and wanted to talk. And she said, I've just inherited some money. I have $15,000 that, I'm not quite sure what to do with. Do you have any ideas? Oh, do I have an idea? So it was like a miracle. It was like, it felt like it was destined. The timing was just right, and the interest was there, and the enthusiasm, and somehow the universe just conspired to move it all along. And so that was the beginning of it.
Yeah, that's remarkable.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it continues to. It feels like it continues that way, like it ever
Yeah.
has since. That things just kind of fall into place.
Yeah.
That's great. So we'll shift over here to talking about the book. One thing, Joseph, that's really so striking to me about it is that so much of what you did in this first retreat, this 30-day retreat, still is true of what we do at IMS today.
Yeah.
It's really like, you nailed it right out of the gate, but the practice has evolved over the past 4 decades since then. Can you talk about that?
I don't. I wouldn't say so much that the practice has evolved that much, because the basic instructions in the book are the same instructions we're still giving. So the practice has remained pretty consistent. But it was interesting for me to re-look at the book, when it was reissued, because I hadn't really looked at it for many years. And it was quite fun to reread it. First, it reminded me of a lot of old teaching stories that I had forgotten, and so reading, oh, that's a good story. I really should use that again. But what struck me in this first book was that because I was teaching to a group of people at that time who really didn't have much of a background in Buddhism or the Buddhist teachings, unlike today, where many people come to retreats who over the years, may have practiced quite a bit already and studied quite a bit, although we also get many new students. But in those years, it was all really quite new for most people. And so in the book and in that month teaching at Sequoia Forest, I really wanted to cover as much as possible the broad range of the teachings, to really cover a lot of different topics. And so there's that breadth, there's that scope of teachings in the book. But because of that, it really wasn't possible to dive deeply into all of those teachings. But the essence of like teachings on the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path and karma and non-self and all the topics. So I really wanted to cover them bringing in a lot of different kinds of stories, from, as you mentioned in the intro, just from different traditions. And that really reflected, in a way, my teaching reflecting my practice and teachers at that time. So my first teacher was, as I mentioned, Anagarika Munindra, and he was a very unusual teacher. He was completely immersed in the traditional Theravada teachings, having been in Burma, and devoting themselves both to the practice and the study. But he was very quirky, and he had a very open, spacious mind. He was not rigid or narrow in his approach, which I really loved. He just had a very broad understanding, realizing that people can learn from many sides and many traditions. So he always encouraged that. He was never trying to hold on to his students, and I still am very grateful for his being my first teacher, because he set that foundation of a kind of openness to a broad range of teachings that I still carry and still value, so much. Over the years since then, as I studied with different teachers and got more into the depth of each of those teachings. So, for example, in this book, there's a chapter on the Eightfold Path. In my last book, Mindfulness, which is 400 pages. Yeah, there it is. John's showing it. So I would have a chapter on each step of the Eightfold Path, and so over the years, it's like there's just greater depth or filling out of the teachings. Yeah, and that was largely because, as I practiced with different teachers, in my last Theravada teacher, Sayadaw U Pandita, he taught from that perspective, just a tremendous depth of detail. This may be an amusing anecdote, I'm not sure, but in one course with Sayadaw U Pandita, who was also a great meditation master and a scholar, he was talking about the Satipatthana Sutta, and that's the discourse on the four foundations of mindfulness. That's what Satipatthana means. Satipatthana. So in one retreat, Sayadaw U Pandita gave about 10 talks on the meaning of the syllable pa of Satipatthana. So that's just an indication of the different levels of depth one can go into, as one is engaging the teachings.
Yeah. I think another thing that's great about the experience of insight too is I think you really come away with a sense for the dynamics of a retreat, and
yeah,
it gives people a sense for what they might expect while being on one.
Yeah.
Do you want to comment on
Yeah.
that, like about
Yeah.
the rhythms of an insight meditation retreat?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, this book came out of the teachings of that first month-long course that we taught at Sequoia. And it was really set up. I mean, the schedule and the way it was taught really reflected how we would do a retreat in India. So I wasn't really making that up. The schedule was just sitting, meditation, walking, sitting, walking, eating, sitting, walking, with instructions being given every morning, a Dharma talk in the evening, a lot of Q&A questions. And in rereading the book, I was struck, after each chapter, there is a section of questions and my responses to them. And that's really, I think, a very valuable part of the book, because the questions are ones that are quite typical. They typically come up for people. And there are a lot of them, interspersed in the book. And so there's a chance really to explore some of the questions that might come up now for people reading it, because it's the same, it's the same basic questions that often arise, and the responses address those very basic questions. I found it interesting, again, just rereading the questions and the answers. Yeah, it felt pretty good.
Yeah, and the schedule, right, as you say, even right
Yeah,
down to the schedule, the daily schedule that you followed is
yeah,
very similar to what you get when we're doing residential retreats at
yeah,
IMS.
yeah, yeah.
One difference, though, is there's a nice dinner at IMS now, like a good dinner after a hearty lunch. I think it says in there tea at
Right.
6 on your first retreat, but maybe was that tea in the British sense of tea, or
Well, it was something in between. We said tea, but it was tea and a very light snack. It certainly was not a dinner, but just a little something. Um, yeah, and it was a beautiful retreat because, as I say, it was in the Sequoia National Forest, and people were living in tents, basically platform tents. So we were right out in the middle of nature, and it's a beautiful place to practice, especially in that intensive way for that long a period of time. Um, but the book now really could provide a framework for people who wanted to do a self-retreat, especially in these times when a lot of the centers are closed. Uh, some people have the opportunity actually to practice at home, to find some place where they could do a self-retreat. And the book really provides a template, really, could do a month retreat and just follow along with it. Yeah, and I think it would be very supportive for that.
yeah. And maybe Joseph, for those who aren't familiar with insight meditation, could you talk a little bit about what that practice is like, and how it differs from other forms of meditation?
Yeah, so basically, across traditions, not only in Buddhism, but different spiritual traditions, I think generally there are two main streams of meditative practice. So one stream, and again, this cuts across spiritual traditions, one stream is the development of concentration, of one-pointedness. And that really comes about by settling on a single object of meditation. And that could be the breath, it could be a sound, it could be a mantra, it could be an image, it could be a light. We just take any one object and train the mind to stay on it. And over time, the mind can get extremely concentrated and still and quiet in that, and really go to quite extraordinary depths of concentration. The other stream of practice we might call insight practices or wisdom practices. And in these kind of practices, the emphasis is not so much on staying on a single object, but developing concentration on changing objects. And so that kind of concentration is called momentary concentration, because the mind is concentrated, but on continually changing objects moment to moment. And this leads, as the name implied, it leads to insight into the impermanence of everything, of this whole mind-body process. And we begin to refine that perception. So there's something I call NPMs, which are noticings per minute. So in this insight practice, at first, as we begin, the NPMs are pretty low. Maybe we notice, I don't know, 10 things a minute or 20 things a minute, something like that. But as we practice it, the NPMs go way up. And so then even in a simple experience of the breath, instead of us perceiving the breath as a single thing, an in-breath and an out-breath, we begin to see that the in-breath, the experience of it actually becomes many, many, many micro sensations within the in-breath. So we're seeing impermanence on an increasingly refined level. Or it could be sensations, or it could be a sound. We ring a bell and we hear the bell. For somebody who's not really paying attention in this way, we might, oh yeah, I hear a sound, there's a sound of the bell, as being one thing. But if we're really being mindful and attentive, we hear the sound of the bell and we hear all the many, vibrations and variations and nuances within the sound. And so our insight into impermanence becomes really refined. And how to say this? It's not something external to us. We see that everything we are, this whole mind-body process, is in this process of very rapid change, which mostly we're not aware of. We tend to solidify our experience. So this is would be the path of insight practices or wisdom practices. Now, these two are not contradictory at all. The concentration and the insight very much support each other, because the more concentration we have, the deeper our insight is going to be. And so the two really work together.
And the big payoff, right, for recognizing on that deep experiential level the permanence of everything is that you don't get too attached to anything, right?
Well, exactly. And so the big payoff, so we could say within the Buddhist teaching, the biggest payoff is awakening. We could say enlightenment, although there are many other payoffs along the way as well. But the Buddha described, one might say, the condition for awakening or the methodology for awakening in one very succinct phrase. Of course, he talked about it in many different ways, but one of the phrases he used was liberation through non-clinging. So we could see that the point of all of these practices, even though many, many insights and states of concentration come along the way, but the freedom of mind comes from the letting go of grasping, letting go of clinging. Why? So there's one very obvious, but often overlooked truth, and that is that if we're attached or cling to that which in its nature changes, we suffer. If we're attached to summer, how do we feel in winter? If we're attached to youth, how do we feel as we're getting older? Even if we're attached to health, which is a good thing, and we should certainly take care of ourselves. But if we're attached to health, if we cling to it, then when we inevitably fall ill at one point or another, in age, then we're going to suffer. So the connection between clinging and grasping and the suffering in our lives becomes very, very clear. And that's why the Buddha said liberation through non-clinging. And that's really the essence of the whole path. And as my first teacher, Munindraji, said, it's simple, but not easy. And so he would use that phrase a lot: simple, but not easy. So it's not complicated, but we really have to practice, because our conditioning to be attached to the pleasant, and to push away what's unpleasant, that goes very deep.
Yeah, and it's not something, right, that we can just intellectually understand and we're saying.
Yeah, no.
It's got to be.
Yeah, it has to be embedded within us, and that is precisely what meditation practice does. It takes it from being perhaps an interesting concept or intellectual exercise, and the actual lived experience of it, and that's where the transformation takes place, on that level.
Yeah. And the book offers a lot of instructions on how to practice. There's a chapter on how to work with thoughts, another on how to work with sense objects, another with feelings. So how do these foci differ, and what can they tell us?
Could you ask that question again?
Yeah. So you got.
I didn't quite get it.
Well, there are some things that we can focus on: thoughts that come up. We have thoughts that come up. We
Right.
have feelings, other objects of the sense. And you can kind of vary what you're focusing on. But how do those? What can we learn something from feelings that we don't necessarily from thoughts?
Yeah. So there's a lot embedded in that question. So first, just to describe the methodology a bit. Generally, in the way we're teaching, we would start by giving the mind just a basic primary object of attention. And usually we suggest the breath, but it could be anything. It could be just the body posture, or it could perhaps be sound. But we take one object as the anchor, primary object, and we practice developing some concentration by directing our minds to that. So this is a kind of directed awareness. Once there is some level of steadiness, it doesn't have to be, we don't have to become adepts at it, but just enough so that we're not simply continually getting lost and wandering in our minds. So once there's just a baseline of some steadiness or stability, then the practice moves from the directed awareness on the primary objects, perhaps the breath, to then becoming mindful of or opening to any other object in our experience that calls our attention, that becomes predominant. So if we're sitting and feeling the breath and then a thought arises, so becoming mindful of the thought, thinking, that becomes the object for that moment. And we see the impermanence of that, or other sensations in the body, or emotions. And this is an important part because we want to discover every part of ourselves. We really want to open up. There's one line from a Japanese poet. Her name was Izumi, and I don't remember exactly the whole poem, but the last line of it was she was just contemplating her experience, and the last line of the poem was, "And no part left out." And that really captures the essence of the meditative journey. It's like developing mindfulness or awareness so that no part is left out. And this is important because we can be attached or reactive or caught in some way by many different aspects of our lives. Some people get very caught by different emotions that are arising, or certain kinds of emotions. Most of us get caught over and over again, get lost in the stories of our minds, just all the thoughts that are going through when we're not being mindful that we're thinking. It's like we're lost in a dream for however long that is. And then we went, this was just a thought. It's like going to the movies. And of course, this is the reason why we go to the movies, going to the movies and getting lost in the story, forgetting that it's just a movie on the screen. Of course, we wouldn't pay the $10 to try to remember that it's just a movie. We want to get lost in the story in that situation. But in terms of living our lives and understanding and coming to a place of freedom, it's really important to know what's the movie and what's really happening, because that's where the freedom is. And so we go from this directed awareness on the primary object to a more open, choiceless awareness, which takes in whatever's arising. And this gets to be a very interesting discovery. We really learn about the nature of different emotions. The not so much the storyline of the emotion, but the energy of it. It's like, anger feels like this, or happiness feels like this, or joy feels like this, or jealousy, whatever it is. So we're exploring the very nature of the emotions, and even on another level, and for those people listening who may have some interest in this, this is a question that I found tremendously revealing with respect to thoughts. Because mostly as we become aware of thoughts, which come a lot, both in our lives and in our meditation practice. So thoughts, many kinds of thoughts are going to arise. But mostly we are just completely involved in what the thought is saying, in the content of the thought, and reactive to it in one way or another, either liking it or not liking it, whatever. Very few people ever ask the question, what is a thought? Not what is a thought saying, but what is the thought as a phenomenon? So I just find this incredibly interesting. First, because it's a phenomenon that happens incredibly often throughout the day. And more than that, when we're not mindful of our thoughts, they are driving our lives. Go here, go there, do this, do that. It's like we're slaves of our thoughts. They're the little dictators of our mind when we're not mindful. And yet when we consider what is a thought, and we're looking directly at a thought arising in the mind, we see that it's little more than nothing. It's just this little blip of energy that arises in the mind, coming and going, no problem at all. And so the realization that the only power thoughts have is the power that we give them, that is life transforming. Yeah. So instead of being driven by, the thoughts which have been conditioned by so many things in our lives, if we really understand the empty nature of thought as a phenomena, then we can bring just this space of discernment. Oh, is this thought worth acting on? Or should I just let it go? And it gives us that freedom. So all of this is these are kinds of things that we discover in meditation practice.
Yes. Well, Joseph, I was going to say, so we've been talking for a while. Shall we do a brief sit and then take some questions? And for those of you out there who have a question for Joseph that you want to send in to us through the Facebook message, you can go ahead and do so. Shall we do that,
Yeah.
Joseph?
Yeah, great. So just as a preface to this 2-minute sit, there was a Zen kind of a teacher, writer. His name was Paul Reps, and he was quite well known back in the 60s, 70s. He wrote this quite well-known book at that time, Zen Flesh, Zen Bones. Anyway, he was giving a talk, I think it was at the San Francisco Zen Center, and he suggested people sit for just 3 minutes, because in 3 minutes, you can't really do anything wrong. So he was extolling the value of the 3 minutes sit. So we're gonna follow in that lineage for right now, anyway.
And that's a perfect thing to remember for the 30-day meditation challenge, because if it's just 5 minutes, you can't screw it
up. Yeah. So here we go.
Okay.
So take a reasonably comfortable posture in a way that enhances alertness. So you're sitting up reasonably straight, and you might let the eyes close gently and softly, and relax the eyes and the shoulders, relax the jaw. Maybe take a few deep breaths just to settle into the body. Consciously deep breaths. And let the breath come to its own natural rhythm. Feeling the whole body and being aware of the body breathing. Breathing in, know you're breathing in. Breathing out, know you're breathing out. It's really that simple. Keep in mind that it's not a breathing exercise, but an exercise in awareness. So you can feel the breath however it presents itself. Sometimes long or short or rough or smooth. Simply to be aware. You should hear a sound, simply become aware of hearing. Or other sensations in the body. Simply become aware of them, seeing how they change, coming back to the breath. And for a few moments, stay alert for the arising of thought or image in the mind. As soon as you become aware that the mind is thinking or seeing an image, you might make just this very soft mental note of thinking or seeing as a support for being mindful of it. Breathing in, know you're breathing in. Breathing out, know you're breathing out. And it's a very brief exercise in concentration. And to close the meditation, see if you can be with the next 5 breaths, being with each one from beginning to end. When you're ready, you can open your eyes, reconnect with the world around you.
Nice. Thank you. So yeah, we do have some questions here. The first one I will ask you, let's see. Someone is asking, how do we relate in a healthy way to the clinging and craving for those we love, our spouses or children?
So this is a very interesting question to me that has come up a lot over the years. I think it would be for those who really want to explore this in a deeper way. I would suggest really looking carefully at the difference between love and attachment, love and clinging, because when it's unexamined, I think very commonly for most people, love and attachment are conflated. And for many people, I think it's almost hard to imagine how you could love without attachment. The two have just become so intertwined. But it is very interesting to look carefully at what each of those feelings are. And so my experience of that is when I look at the times when I feel most loving, it's the energy of giving. It's like a generosity of the heart. The feeling of love is wanting the other person to be happy and to be well and to flourish. So it's this extending of our energy in a very generous way for the happiness of the other person. When we look at the feeling of attachment, it's just the opposite. It's not a generosity of the heart, it's a holding. It's a grasping at, which is very different. In fact, in a way, it's the complete opposite of love. And so what could be an interesting experiment first is for each person interested to explore for yourself in your own experience. You're not just kind of listening to these words and either believing or not believing, but really take a look, and see for yourself. And if you can see that difference in your own experience between the feeling of love and the feeling of attachment, then you might see that it is very possible to enhance the feeling of love without attachment, and seeing actually that attachment not only doesn't enhance it, it actually is detrimental to it. Because, where do the feelings of jealousy come from? Or fear about the relationship, or the clinging, the trying to hold on. That all comes from the grasping. That doesn't come from the love. And so a lot of the unwholesome emotions that might come up, in an intimate relationship, are really coming from that force of clinging. But we have to make the effort to see for ourselves the difference between these two states, and to begin to trust that we can love without attachment, that the attachment doesn't add anything, to the love. I'm not suggesting, well, I'll go back to what Munindra said. This is simple. It's not complicated, but it's not easy, because our conditioning has been that these two elements are so intertwined. Yeah. So again, I would encourage people, and this is what has inspired me over all these years of practice, just a lot of interest in understanding what my heart and mind are doing, in different situations, and what causes suffering and what leads to greater peace and happiness. So it's all that interest in investigating, which I would really encourage people who are interested, in this exploration.
Yeah, what's going on in here, the more we look at it, sometimes it's more complicated than we think. Another person is asking that if you were to rewrite the book today, is there anything that you would do differently?
Well, that's a little difficult question. In a way, one might say that my last book was a rewrite of my first book, in the sense of just expanding, to a very great extent, each of the teachings presented in the first book. So there's actually nothing new in this latest big book, other than it goes into greater detail and depth about the range of teachings presented in the first one. So they really are serving different purposes in a way. But when I reread, the first one, I mean, one of the changes that I actually suggested to Shambhala, and I'm not sure whether they acted on it or not, but when I was rereading it, back in those early years, I was much less tuned in to, at that time, the big feminist movement, and so just as you might remember from those days, just as an example, just in the use of pronouns, it'll always use he to refer to everybody. Well, in reading it now, that really feels very antiquated and not very helpful. So rewriting things in that way of really catching up to certainly what I have learned, in terms of just society, and the values, that we have now, and the importance, of addressing things in a skillful way. So those are the kind of changes that I would certainly make.
We've got a number of questions. Maybe I'll just ask a couple more for you. One person is asking about whether you think the development of Buddhism in America represents a unique phase in the overall historical arc of Buddhism worldwide, and is there a unique experience of the Dharma in America today?
Yeah, well, that very question, in a way, prompted my writing. It's another one of my books, One Dharma, because in coming back to the West and teaching, for quite a while, I think something unique is happening, and that is that really for the first time in the history of Buddhism, many different Buddhist traditions are meeting, in the West and in America in particular, but also in the West in general. These different traditions, Tibetan and Zen and Burmese and Thai, the traditions and teachers and students in them are meeting and interacting with one another really for the first time ever. Because in Asia, most of these traditions are quite isolated from one another. And for example, the Tibetans I met really don't know anything about Burmese Buddhism. And my Burmese teachers really don't know anything about Tibetan Buddhism. But here, we have a chance for those interested just to learn from a lot of different traditions. And that's what prompted this whole idea in my mind of there's really one Dharma, and there are many different expressions of it. There are many different fingers pointing at the moon. So we get in trouble if we get attached to the finger, But if we actually just see the fingers as they're just pointing. So all the teachings are really just different skillful means for freeing the mind from clinging. Because as the Buddha said, liberation through non-clinging. So many different approaches, and different ways of practice. So I think there is a kind of Western Buddhism that's emerging that in some way or another is integrating elements from different traditions. And very commonly when people come on retreat now, and they talk about the practices they've done, very many will have practiced in several different traditions. And I think one of the responsibilities we have as a teacher, when possible, is to see, okay, how can we hold all this in unity rather than in conflict? And I think there is a way, to really see all the teachings, as I say, as different skillful means for freeing the mind. So I think this is a unique time in the history and transmission of the Buddhist teachings.
Well, I was going to say, and as the night here goes on on the east towards bedtime, we've got a question here that's about a different kind of liberation. Can meditation help with insomnia? Falling asleep.
Well, I think it's very individual. So for some people, I think it can very much because it can tranquilize the whole system. And there are many, sleep apps, that work with different relaxation techniques. But it can also work in the other way, that, the meditation just enhances the mindfulness so much and the investigative quality so much. And so if the investigation aspect of the mind becomes very strong, then you're trying to go to sleep. And I've had this experience. I can be going to sleep and dozing off and then get so interested in the process of falling asleep that it completely wakes me up. So I don't think there's one. I think it just works differently for different people. Good luck.
Well, you just reminded me, my first couple week-long retreats at IMS, I experienced sleep in an interesting way because, like the first day or so, you're falling asleep kind of on the mat when you first get there, because
Yeah.
you're just kind of going, and all of a sudden you're not. So you kind of, it's trying to stay awake.
Yeah.
And then you sleep so soundly at night. And then maybe a few days in, suddenly you're not sleeping so well at night.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
aren't I supposed to be resting more? And then you realize, well, it's because I'm during the day, I'm not, my mind is kind of in a relaxed state.
Yes.
It's
No, exactly. And a common experience for people on retreat is that the need for sleep gets much less. So normally in our lives, it's suggested that 7 hours, 8 hours, but on retreat, quite naturally, the need for sleep will go down to 6 hours, 5 hours, even 4 hours, as the meditation develops. So a retreat situation is quite unique in that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I think too, when people, when they see, like in your book, the schedule of the retreat that you did, which starts at like 5 in the morning, goes till 9, and then maybe later on at night, it can seem daunting, but when you're in there and you're doing it, it's like you say, you staying up later and meditating is kind of welcome, and you have more energy than perhaps you might think you would.
Yeah.
So.
And also for people, this is just maybe a suggestion for people who might want to be using the book as a framework for their own retreat. And maybe this might be good for people who already have some experience in practice, but it could be an interesting investigation. Can play with the schedule, especially if you're on retreat and don't really have other responsibilities. So just as an example of that, there was one period in my practice where I just loved sitting like at 2 in the morning. The hours from 2 in the morning to 5, because the whole surrounding world was just so quiet. And there was a beauty in that time that it was so sweet to be sitting in that silence. But to do that, so I had to rearrange my whole schedule. So I might go to sleep at 8 o'clock, and then get up at 2. So there's a lot of potential for creativity for people just to experiment, and see what schedule works the best for you and inspires you, really inspires you to practice.
And well, let's see, we've been well over an hour here, and I think on that note there about being inspired to practice, again, it's the experience of insight, and it's our IMS book club pick for January, and we're going to be doing the 30-day meditation challenge with daily sits. Joseph will kick it off on January 1. We'll have a conversation about the book and about the practice, and then daily sits beginning from the 2nd through the end of the month. Joseph will be meeting at 11 o'clock that morning on New Year's Day. And then it will be at 9 a.m. for each morning that's East Coast time throughout the rest of the month. And if you're interested in joining, it's right there on our website, the IMS website at dharma.org. So anyway, I want to thank everyone for joining us. And Joseph, I want to thank you for our first Facebook Live together.
Yeah, it was a pleasure.
And thank you for doing this. And thanks for writing this book.
Yeah.
Well, bye, everybody.